Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second and final meeting of the Hospital Robocall Protection Group, or the Hrpg, which we will now call to order. Thank you for being here today. My name is Donna Cyrus. I'm the designated federal officer of this advisory committee. My colleague, Elisa Katz, is the deputy designated federal officer. A special thanks to the chair of the group, Dave Summit, Chief Information Security Officer at the Moffitt Cancer Center, and the Vice Chair, Patrick Halley, Senior Vice President, Policy and Advocacy at US Telecom. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the Chairman of the FCC, Chairman Ajit Pai. Welcome, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you, Ms. Cyrus, for the warm introduction and for those killer frames. What a better way to start this week. Good morning to everybody on the call. Welcome, as Ms. Cyrus said, to the second and final meeting of the Hospital Robocall Protection Group. This is, of course, the Federal Advisory Committee that Congress tasked with recommending best practices to help hospitals and voice service providers and federal, state, and governments combat unlawful robocalls to hospitals. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the group's members for their professionalism and dedication over the last 5 months in delivering a solid and thoughtful and practical set of recommendations under a very tight deadline compared to what we typically do. I especially want to thank the group's chair, Dave Summit, as well as its vice chair, Patrick Halley, also the working group chairs, Joseph Gelato, John Hrpg, and Creasy Johnson, for keeping the group on course and steering it to such a successful conclusion. Finally, I'd like to recognize and thank FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr and FTC Commissioner Noah Phillips for their service to the group, as well as the group's distinguished designated federal officer, Donna Cyrus, its deputy designated federal officer, and my good friend, Elisa Katz, and the rest of the dedicated staff in the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau's Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. Now, we all know, of course, about the difficulties of the times that we've labored under over the last 9 months or so. And few know those difficulties better than those who work in the healthcare system. Obviously, crucial to the success of our efforts to confront the pandemic is making sure that our hospitals, our healthcare providers, can perform at the highest level. Unlawful robocalls to hospitals undermine that goal directly. They waste time and they otherwise impair the ability of these professionals to perform their critical tasks and help the American people. Whether it's unsolicited spam calls, whether it is scammers using fake caller IDs, whether it's bad actors spoofing calls to hospital employees seeking confidential information, or whether it's any other kind of improper robocall, the effect is the same. Time and attention is diverted from the management of the health and well-being of American patients. For example, we understand from the group's chair, Mr. Summit, that within the last 2 weeks, the Moffitt Cancer Center was the target of an attack of over 45,000 calls by robocallers who impersonated Social Security Administration employees in an attempt to get recipients to disclose their Social Security information. This and other cases like this are unacceptable. And this is why we constituted the Hospital Robocall Protection Group with all of you experts. And this is why we're here this morning. The best practices that the group has recommended offer a thorough and practical approach that voice providers, hospitals, and governments at different levels can employ to fight this scourge. By dividing the best practice recommendations into the broad categories of prevention on the one hand and response and mitigation on the other, the group has provided tools both to help prevent robocalls from affecting hospitals in the first place, as well as helping hospitals and other stakeholders minimize the damage of robocalls that have occurred. And you've done all of this, as I said, within a quick time frame, and you've done it in a cooperative and collegial way. And for that, I'm very grateful. As I observed at the outset of the group's activities back in July, our nation's patients and their families and their loved ones want and need their healthcare professionals to be unburdened by the pernicious distraction of unlawful robocalls. And so I want to commend and thank all of you for spending time on this important effort, both within the public and private sectors. I'm grateful to you for lending your talents and your dedication to this important challenge, and look forward to working with you in the days to come on making sure that we can ensure that the healthcare system is freed as much as possible from this scourge. I thank you so much for letting me participate this morning, and I wish you all the best in your deliberations today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would now like to introduce Patrick Weber, Chief of the FCC's Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau.
Thank you, Donna. Good morning, everyone, and welcome again to the final meeting of the Hospital Robocall Protection Group. The Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau deeply appreciates the hard work, expertise, and dedication that the group has displayed under the short time frame required by the Trace Act. Today, with the presentation of its recommended best practices for combating illegal robocalls to hospitals, the group has completed a critical step that will aid voice service providers, hospitals, states, and the federal government in their efforts to protect the nation's healthcare institutions and their patients from the disruptive distraction of illegal robocalls. You have a full agenda today. The day's presentations will begin with an executive summary of the group's recommendations that will provide an overview of the impact of unlawful robocalls on hospitals and current government and industry efforts to address the problem. You will then receive briefings on best practices for voice service providers by Working Group 1, on best practices for hospitals by Working Group 2, and on best practices for federal and state governments by Working Group 3. As I mentioned at the group's first meeting in July, CGB is the Commission's primary link to the American consumer, and as such is on the front lines to protect consumers from robocalls. That continues to be true today, because while the works group will be complete once it issues its best practices, CGB's work will continue. As you may be aware, the Trace Act requires the Commission to conclude a proceeding to assess the extent to which the voluntary adoption of such best practices can be facilitated to protect hospitals and other institutions. This proceeding must be completed 180 days from the issuance of the group's best practices, which will be around June 12th of 2021. CGB looks forward to working on this proceeding and is grateful to the group for providing us such a thorough and comprehensive set of recommendations. I'd like to express my sincere thanks to my Deputy Bureau Chief Barbara Espin and IGA Division Chief Greg Cook for their work in managing the team from CGB's Office of Intergovernmental Affairs that administered this group. In that regard, I want to give special thanks to the group's DFO Donna Cyrus and Deputy DFO Aliza Katz for their great efforts in organizing and facilitating the work of the group, including today's meeting. Finally, and most importantly, I want to thank Hrpg's dedicated chair and co-chair, Dave Summit and Patrick Halley, working group chairs, Joseph Delato, John Hrpg, and Creasy Johnson, and all of the group's members who served so effectively and efficiently. We are honored by your dedication to and seamless completion of this important work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. At this time, Hrpg Chair Dave Summit will make some brief remarks.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Donna. Morning, Chairman Pai, Commissioner Carr, and Commissioner Phillips, and Patrick Weber. It was an honor to have been chosen to serve as chairman of the Healthcare Robo Protection Group, and equally an honor to have worked with the dedicated members. The issue of spam calls and robocalls is and has been a continuing problematic and potentially life-threatening issue for our healthcare infrastructure for too long. This group has worked diligently and hard these past few months to formulate a set of recommendations for the Commission that can aid in combating these unlawful issues under the Trace Act. I want to thank my organization, the H. Lee Moffitt Cancer Center and Research Institute, for allowing me to spend time in this important topic. The center's mission is to contribute to the prevention and cure of cancer. Anything that can be done to remove a threat to that mission, as well as other healthcare missions, should be done. I want to thank Patrick Halley for the co-chair of our protection group. Patrick kept things moving throughout the process and was the right person to have been selected, and I appreciate his work. There were 3 sub-working groups that were created, and I would like to recognize those who contributed. Chairman of Working Group 1, Joseph Delato, Working Group 2, John Hrpg, and Working Group 3, Creasy Johnson. Members of the working groups are John Brault, Mark Collier, John Cunningham, Aaron Foss, Gunnar Halley, Rebecca Johnson, DeWitt Kasai, Irene Leach, Richard Lovich, David McCoy, Wysam Nowam, Chris Shipley, and Linda Vanderloop. I'd also like to recognize the FCC personnel that kept us on track and on time. Donna Cyrus, Elisa Katz, Tracy Nair, Greg Cook, and Theodore Marcus. Thank you again for this opportunity, and we look forward to presenting our report.
Thank you so much, Dave. And now we will hear from FTC Commissioner Noah Phillips. We are also scheduled to hear from Commissioner Carr. Is Commissioner Carr here? Okay, so please, Commissioner Phillips, we'll hear your brief remarks.
Thank you, Donna. So I want to begin by echoing Chairman Pai and thanking everyone, in particular the chairs and staff, for their excellent work on this project at such a difficult time and on such a short time frame. It's a great example of how government, industry, and consumer advocates can come together to advance policy for the common good. Illegal robocalls are more than an annoyance. They facilitate fraud, make consumers skeptical of legitimate and important calls, and, as Congress recognized in creating the Hospital Robocall Working Group, impact public health and safety. Ending illegal robocalls is a priority for the FTC, and we are approaching them with a three-pronged strategy. First, aggressive law enforcement, including 150 law enforcement actions filed against more than 900 defendants. Two, promoting technological solutions. And three, consumer and business education. This year, we filed 2 law enforcement actions in federal court against VoIP service providers accused of assisting and facilitating illegal calls, and we will continue that enforcement. I commend Chairman Pai, Commissioner Carr, and the rest of the FCC for all of their efforts fighting the scourge of robocalls. I would be remiss if I did not note with some sadness Chairman Pai's upcoming departure. He has been a great partner on this issue, and we will miss his vision, his dedication, and his leadership. I very much appreciate his invitation to join the HRPG, and I want to thank Congress for focusing on hospitals in creating this group. I also want to recognize all the work that has been put into this project over the last few months, both by working group members and agency staff. In particular, thanks to Will Maxon, who took time out of his schedule fighting illegal robocallers to be the day-to-day lead for the FTC on this project. The HRPG has done important work at a difficult time, and I am hopeful that the report will guide the efforts of hospitals, VoIP providers, and government agencies in protecting medical facilities, healthcare workers, and patients from illegal robocalls. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Phillips. Next, HRPG Vice Chair Patrick Halley will give an executive summary of the HRPG best practices recommendations.
Thank you, Donna, very much. I will provide an executive summary. I will try to keep it fairly high level because we're going to jump into a lot of the details here in the subsequent presentations. Before we do that, though, I just also have to express my thanks to the chair of this group, Dave Summit, as well as all of the members for their hard work. This was done very quickly and I think professionally, and produced a good result in a fairly compressed amount of time. And I also want to especially thank the working group chairs. Before I get into the summary, I do also want to take an opportunity here to thank Chairman Pai and his staff, but in particular Chairman Pai for his leadership on this issue. Since he started as chair, one of the clear priorities and the top consumer priority he made clear was fighting this scourge of illegal robocalls. And I think the commission, if you just look back at the work that they've done under his leadership, has taken a substantial number of steps to address this challenge. And that, of course, can't get done without the staff, those in his office, including Zenji Nakazawa, Nirali Patel, and others as well. And of course, in all of the bureaus. And this is one of these issues that, for those who may not know it, works across multiple bureaus, at least 3, in the Enforcement Bureau, in the Wireline Competition Bureau, in the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, including the staff who have made this process possible. So huge kudos to Chairman Pai and his team and all the bureaus who have been working on this. And thank you for your leadership. So to provide an overview of the executive summary, Congress required the formation of the Hospital Robocall Protection Group in Section 14 of the Traceback Act, which the Congress passed in the December of last year and the president signed in early January this year. And the agency announced the HRPG in March and held its first meeting in July. So as required by the Traceback Act, the HRPG consists of an equal number from the following categories: voice service providers that serve hospitals, companies that focus on mitigating unlawful robocalls, consumer advocacy organizations, providers of one-way voice over IP services, hospitals, and state government officials focused on combating unlawful robocalls. The Traceback Act also required the HRPG to include one representative of the FCC, which is Commissioner Carr, and one representative of the FTC, who you just heard from prior to my remarks. And so specifically, recognizing the challenges that hospitals face on a daily basis from a variety of different types of robocalls, from minor nuisance calls that can flood the lines if they're done in a high volume, to telephone denial of service calls, to outright fraud attempts. Congress directed that the HRPG issue best practices in 3 areas, specifically how voice service providers can better combat unlawful robocalls made to hospitals, how hospitals can better protect themselves from such calls, including by using unlawful robocall mitigation techniques, and how federal and state governments can help combat such calls. So the HRPG had its first meeting in July and subsequently established 3 working groups to make recommendations as required by the Traceback Act. The first working group was chaired by Joe Delato, Vice President of Voice and Unified Communications Products at Charter Communications, and he chaired the working group addressing how voice service providers can better combat unlawful robocalls. Second, John Hrpg, Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity and Risk at the American Hospital Association. He chaired Working Group 2, addressing recommendations on how hospitals can protect themselves. And finally, Working Group 3 was chaired by Creasy Johnson, Special Deputy Attorney General in the North Carolina Attorney General's Office. And she chaired the working group focusing on recommendations on how the federal and state governments can help combat unlawful robocalls. And the chairman touched on this in his remarks, but what we decided to do was divide the recommendations into 2 different sections. One is on prevention, and whether it's voice service providers or hospitals or government entities, what each of them can do to prevent robocalls. And then second, what each of those groups can do to effectively respond and mitigate those robocalls, the unlawful robocalls, when they do in fact reach a hospital. And later today, following my remarks, we will begin the discussion on what each of those recommendations were. So thank you very much, and back to you, Donna.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. And now we will get background information on the best practices recommendations from Dave Summit, Patrick Halley, and Christy Thompson. Dave Summit will speak first on why we are here, the impact of robocalls on hospitals.
Donna?
Yes.
I just wanted to point out and welcome Commissioner Carr, who has just joined the
Thank you so much, Elisa. Commissioner Carr, would you like to give your brief remarks at this time?
Sure, happy to do it. Don't mean to interrupt the actual work of the people who've been getting it done, but really honored to join as well. I think, as Patrick pointed out, this group has put in a tremendous amount of work over a short period of time under very unusual circumstances. Our own individual work lives have been disrupted with this pandemic, personal lives have been disrupted, and all of you took on top of that the added burden of working on it. It's on this hospital robocall working group, and that's obviously because of the importance of this. Robocalls are a massive problem across all sectors of our economy, everything from disrupting our family dinners to engaging in sort of illegal and scam conduct. And with the pandemic, hospitals have been front of mind for all of us here at the FCC, obviously, and they've been busier than ever. And what we've been seeing, of course, is the important work of frontline healthcare workers getting interrupted, best case scenario, getting interrupted from a flood of robocalls. Worst case scenario, there's fraud and all kinds of other nefarious conduct that takes place. Some hospitals getting thousands of calls per hour. So this is a really excellent group. We've seen such a strong mix of backgrounds and perspectives that I think the chairs were able to pull together and use that to identify really some practical, common sense solutions and recommendations. And I think this is going to go a long way in making a dent in controlling robocalls as to hospitals. And obviously our work at the FCC, my colleagues, their work at the FTC continues across the board to make sure we're shutting down robocalls. But I think in the short run, the recommendations coming out of this group is going to make a big impact in freeing up healthcare providers to continue to do the important work that they've been doing rather than being distracted by these robocalls. So just want to express my gratitude and appreciation for the tremendous amount of hard work that went into this. Again, on top of personal lives, on top of normal everyday work lives, this was an added lift, and you all did it with aplomb. So thank you so much for your work on this, and I'm looking forward to seeing the impact that this work is going to make.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Commissioner. So we're going to jump back on our agenda to the background section, and Dave Summit was just about to tell us why we are here, the impact of robocalls on hospitals.
Thank you again, Donna. You can go to the first slide. So I think we all know why we're here, but just to give a little bit of background, last year, I was given the honor to provide some testimony about the effects of these unlawful calls to a hospital, because we had experienced something very, very bad to happen in 2019, and that was we were inundated with phone calls to our providers and other people in our organization that was pretending to be from the U.S. Department of Justice out of D.C., and it was all about trying to solicit information from our providers and our nurses and others, just for identity theft purposes. But the problem really becomes when you tie up a communication system at a healthcare, you're taking up a lot of resources, and it not only for those that's got to combat it and fight it, but you have to. You're talking about the people that they're trying to call and all that time it's taken away from actual patient care. So I've seen unlawful robocalls in hospitals just starting to ramp up big time in the last couple of years. And these events are life-threatening, and they can interrupt the infrastructure of the hospital for their systems, for their telecommunication, which is, obviously communications is a critical part of healthcare. Next slide. So the biggest thing about all this, we in the healthcare industry, the people that maintain the systems in every healthcare facility, we're very limited in what we can do. We can't just shut off our telephone system, for obvious reasons. We cannot combat this correctly and efficiently without government, law enforcement, and the telecommunications industry that we work with. We just don't have a lot of protections that we can do ourselves. So it's going to be a community-wide effort in this. And as Chairman Pai mentioned at the very beginning of this, ironically, last week when we were finishing up our report, our hospital got hit again with Social Security Administration spam phone calls. And in a 4-day period, we totaled over 45,000 of these calls hitting our infrastructure. And it can be very disruptive. So what we're going to present you today is the presentations that we have is a result of the hard work of all of our industry subject matter experts that got together on these working groups. And I'm telling you, they worked hard and put in some pretty long hours to get this done. And I'm very, very honored and very proud to have been part of this group. So thank you for these comments.
Thank you, Dave. Patrick Halley will now speak on industry efforts to stop unlawful robocalls.
Great, thanks, Donna. So I'm going to reiterate what a couple of different folks have said so far, which is that There is no silver bullet to solving this problem. There are very motivated callers out there, if you will, who have a number of different reasons and motives for making unlawful robocalls, some more nefarious than others. But as I alluded to earlier, there are a number of different types of robocalls that a hospital might receive. And those are described in more detail in the report itself. But they can range from, the high volume calls that all of us receive on a regular basis, such as, your social security number has been compromised, press 1, or this is the IRS and you're in a lot of trouble, press 1, which are not necessarily targeted directly at hospitals, but can nonetheless flood a hospital with dozens or more calls repeatedly at the same time and be a major problem. It can also reach individual patients. There are instances of hospitals being impersonated, and I suspect some of this will be covered by the working group, so I won't go into any more detail other than to say, or even more nefarious specific efforts to take down a hospital system via telephone denial of service attack. So there's lots of different types of robocalls. And before I get into the industry efforts, I think it's helpful to provide a understanding of how these calls actually reach a hospital. And a lot of them are originated internationally. Not all, certainly not all, but many illegal, unlawful robocalls are originated, meaning started overseas before they reach the hospital. And I think there's a common misperception, and I always try to take an opportunity to explain that this is not the case whenever we're having public discussions on this topic, that somebody makes a call and it goes directly from the calling party to who is receiving it. But that's just not how the telephone system works. The reality is somebody makes a call and they decide who they're going to call, whether that's targeted or random. And they very often spoof the number. So it's, appears to be somebody else who's making the call. And they, work with a calling platform that enables them to make one or many calls at once. And then that call is sent on to a provider, a wholesale provider in the call path. And they usually pass it off to another provider who passes it off to another provider. Eventually it gets into the United States. If it is, originated overseas, that first entity who accepts the call in the US then passes it off to another provider who passes it off to another provider, and then it gets to the ultimate end user via their provider, what we call the sort of terminating provider. This can take the form of anywhere from 4 to 6 to 8 different hops in a single call. So that's why it's actually very difficult to stop, because there are so many different routes that these calls can take, and for a variety of different regulatory and business reasons, that's how this system works. So it's very hard to solve it. And because of that, it's just not simple, or there's no single solution to solve the problem. So it really does take everybody working together, as Dave said, as Commissioner Phillips said, to solve this problem. And so industry has been very actively working within the industry itself on a variety of different solutions to solve this problems, and also working very closely and collaboratively with federal and state government partners to identify the folks who are doing this and take action to try to mitigate it. A lot of which you'll hear about in the subsequent reports on the best practices. So high level, let me just hit a few issues, and then I'll leave it to the working group chairs to talk more about it. First and foremost, I've absolutely seen in the last couple of years a heightened effort by voice service providers, certainly the large national providers that you're all familiar with, retail providers that are providing service to end users, but also many of the companies, and there are lots, who are wholesale providers in the middle of the call path. Very significant efforts by industry to establish robocall mitigation programs, increase monitoring of their networks, looking for trends, and is my network being used by who's on it in the way in which they're supposed to be using it? If not, what can I do to address that situation? And increasing efforts to more sufficiently vet their customers. Some of these principles are embodied in anti-robocall principles that state AGs and industry adopted last year, and some more recent work by the Nancy Cato Working Group, who just produced some best practices. So a lot of effort to just know who's on your network, and monitor how it's being used to address problems. Second, most of the larger voice service providers are now offering default blocking to block apparently fraudulent calls. And many of those providers are also offering additional blocking and labeling options to their subscribers, in addition to the voice service providers themselves. There are many applications that are over-the-top applications that are being used for wireline and wireless services. The result of all of these different blocking and labeling, the types of things that say scam likely, you might see that on your phone, have collectively blocked billions of unlawful calls and unwanted calls to American consumers every year. So monitoring our network, blocking calls that shouldn't get through. Third, the voice service providers are implementing new caller ID authentication framework, commonly known as STIR/SHAKEN. Again, I'm not going to get into the details now, other than to say the authentication is effectively going to make it harder for robocallers to get away with spoofing numbers, which will mean that the number that you're seeing and you're receiving the call as this authentication framework is increasingly deployed, you'll be more confident in knowing that the person who's calling you truly is the person who you think is calling you. Many companies are very actively in the voice service provider world implementing STIR/SHAKEN and exchanging authenticated traffic as we speak, and it continues to grow. Another thing that industry is doing is working hard to identify the source of illegal robocalls. As you can imagine, with the way I described the way those calls ultimately reach end users, it's not easy for the actual provider whose customer received the call to know who it was, unless they can subsequently trace back each of those different hops all the way back to the beginning where the call originated. So a few years back, the industry got together and formed what's called the Industry Traceback Group. My organization, US Telecom, is proud to lead that effort. It's over 40 different voice service providers of all different types, wireline, wireless, VoIP, cable, wholesale, you name it, who actively work to exchange information about unlawful robocalls with one another to identify the source of illegal robocalls. And in doing so, we do it for two different reasons. Number one is to help each other, right? To identify, okay, well, who's originating this traffic? Who's taking the traffic and putting onto the US public switch telephone network? Which providers are the ones sending it into the US telephone network? Who's aggregating all these calls internationally? And we're able to gather intelligence about the sources of these illegal robocalls and their paths to educate providers themselves so they can make educated decisions about what traffic they do or don't want to take. And it's making a difference. In addition to that, the industry is doing that so that they can share information with the enforcement agencies. And we have a very collaborative relationship with the FCC, the FTC, DOJ, the IRS, SSA, and many state AGs as well. And that's an important relationship to identify the source of those calls. And that's actually a good way to transition to my colleague, Christy Thompson, who can provide more details on what the government is specifically doing, including in partnership with industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. We'll now, as Patrick said, we'll now hear from Christy Thompson, who is Chief of the Enforcement Bureau's Telecommunications Consumers Division and Hrpg alternate member to Commissioner Carr. And she will tell us about government regulatory and enforcement efforts to stop unlawful robocalls.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I joke with my colleagues frequently that I will talk about robocalls to anyone about as long as they can stand hearing it. So I'm very happy to be here and talking a little bit about the government efforts to stop unlawful robocalls. We have taken, in general, a three-prong approach to this, as you see laid out on the slide here. The first is what I kind of term empowering consumers. And that's where we're really reaching out to consumers to give them the tools that they need to help themselves protect themselves from the problems that illegal robocalls cause. That includes educating them, even as Patrick talked about earlier, about how the telephone system works, so that they understand that it's not their their own telephone provider that is allowing all of these robocalls in, but there's an entire ecosystem, and that's why it's can be challenging to find who the genuine caller is. And then also encouraging in the tech industry and elsewhere, developers and developing blocking tools for consumers to use, ways that they can help select and make better use out of the telecom services that they already have. And then second, we focus a lot of our work on strengthening the networks. That includes rulemakings that help the telecom industry itself fight back against illegal robocalls. Something that I talk to with consumers all of the time is that we are all on the same side here. Both the government and consumers and the industry all hate illegal robocalls. There's no phone company in the world that wants to have to build out the extra capacity, which is expensive, in order to carry robocalls, telephone calls that their customers don't want. That is just an extraordinary waste of resources, and it's a burden on both the industry and on consumers too. So we're all in this together. We are focusing on these rulemakings to help the telecom industry with the steps that they need to take in order to protect their own networks. And then finally, my favorite part, because this is the part I'm most directly involved in, is taking aggressive enforcement of the laws that protect consumers against illegal robocalls. So I'm happy to say that under Chairman Pai's leadership, we have thrown the book at many of the largest and most pernicious American robocallers and spoofers that are out there, and we have done a lot of work that sometimes goes unnoticed by the public because it takes place behind the scenes. But that means working collaboratively at all levels of government. We've taken very much a team approach among many federal agencies, the state AGs, and attempting to use all of our the full extent of our law enforcement authorities against illegal robocallers and attacking them whenever and wherever they appear. So those are our three categories of efforts that we have taken, and we look forward to continuing to develop new tools and new methods to detect and eliminate those illegal robocalls, working together at all three levels: consumer, industry, and government together. And with that, I will turn it over to the next slide.
You're finished with your presentation, right, Christy?
Yep.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your incredible contributions to the group. We so appreciate it. All right, everybody, we're now going to take a short break, and we'll see you back here at 11. Welcome back, everyone. We are now at the 11 o'clock section of our agenda: how voice service providers can better combat unlawful robocalls made to hospitals. The Trace Act directs the Hrpg to make 3 types of recommendations. Joseph Delato, chair of Working Group 1, will now talk about the first of those: how voice service providers can better combat unlawful robocalls made to hospitals.
Thank you, Donna. To set the stage for Working Group 1 recommendations, I just want to make a couple of introductory comments. First, I want to point out that the group was guided by the goal of creating recommendations that could be quickly actionable by voice service providers. Given the government and industry focus that has been driven by the actions of the Commission over the last several years, we recognize the wealth of existing resources and tools that have become available to service providers through a number of collaborative initiatives. Next slide, please. These initiatives include, for example, the Industry Traceback Group, or ITG, the State Attorneys General Service Provider Anti-Robocalling Principles, and the North American Numbering Council's Call Authentication Trust Anchor Working Group report. Because of the great work that has been achieved already, the task of Working Group 1 was really to bring focus and prioritize the application of these efforts and their associated capabilities to hospitals. Secondly, I want to acknowledge that there are some recommendations and parts of recommendations that address treatment of outbound calls, which may be technically outside the charter of preventing malicious robocalls to hospitals. We felt this was useful because of the importance of communications between hospitals and their healthcare ecosystem partners and patients. For example, automated communication like prescription and appointment reminders, test and lab results, and surveys which may be sent by the hospital or by a partner of the hospital. Spoofing of healthcare telephone number identity is a target of bad actors because of the trust that healthcare entities carry with the public. And voice service providers should work with industry and hospitals to assure the delivery of legitimate outbound calls. Next slide, please. The working group's first recommendation is for service providers to implement STIR/SHAKEN. All VSPs providing hospitals with wireline, wireless, or VoIP telephony should implement the STIR/SHAKEN authentication framework on the IP portions of their network. The implementation of the STIR/SHAKEN framework by voice service provider is really a much needed standard for service providers to validate telephone number identity in such a way that it reduces the likelihood of call spoofing. STIR/SHAKEN, if implemented as designed and is widely adopted, can form the basis for voice service providers to assess and make decisions on traffic coming into their networks, and is more effective the more broadly it is deployed across service providers. The working group's second recommendation is for service providers to engage in compliance. All voice service providers providing hospitals with voice services should have appropriate procedures in place to ensure compliance with applicable laws. This recommendation is intended to address the fact that illegal robocall mitigation is evolving and the associated regulatory environment is still developing, so service providers need to stay engaged with government in order to keep up with compliance in this area. Next slide, please. The working group's third recommendation is that voice service providers need to confirm customer identity. All voice service providers providing hospitals with voice services should follow the North American Numbering Council's Call Authentication Trust Anchor Working Group recommendations, titled Best Practices for the Implementation of Call Authentication Frameworks, with respect to the vetting of subscribers and/or customers. The Nancy report was just completed a couple of months ago at the end of September and contains a set of best practices on how to ensure the calling party is accurately identified. These best practices were developed through rigorous deliberation and industry consensus by a broad set of stakeholders. So it is something that could be put into practice relatively quickly. Next slide, please. The working group's fourth recommendation is to analyze, identify, and monitor network traffic. All voice service providers providing hospitals with voice services should follow North American Numbering Council's Call Authentication Trust Anchor Working Group recommendation titled Best Practices for the Implementation of Call Authentication Frameworks, with respect to analyzing voice network traffic to identify and monitor patterns consistent with unlawful robocalls. This recommendation is really in line with Attorney General Principle number 3, which calls for service providers to analyze and monitor network traffic to identify and monitor patterns consistent with robocalls. We realize there are many ways of doing this, but also believe that it is useful to consider how monitoring and analysis will need to adapt as STIR Shaken is rolled out. For example, the understanding of different levels of attestations and treatment of international calls as additional tools that can be applied by network analytics to detect malicious traffic. Next slide, please. The working group's fifth recommendation is for service providers to offer call blocking and call labeling services. All voice service providers providing hospitals with voice services should offer blocking and call labeling services to the extent such enterprise services are available and able to be implemented by hospitals, consistent with any relevant FCC guidance. Voice service providers should work with individual hospital entities to assist them with implementing call blocking and labeling services consistent with hospital individual needs. This recommendation recognizes that hospitals have widely varying technology solutions in place. Some entities have already deployed call blocking technology, while others have older systems that may not be capable of supporting newer blocking and labeling solutions. While there is no one-size-fits-all solution, voice service providers can provide expertise to hospitals to help close this gap. Next slide, please. The working group's sixth recommendation is something that is not addressed in other initiatives, such as the AG principles. But with the increasing diligence and awareness needed to configure services to defend against malicious robocalls, it is important that hospitals are given a clear picture of the tools available to them. To accomplish this, we are recommending that service providers support education and guidance to hospitals for voice services. All voice service providers providing hospital access to material and opportunities for education and guidance relating to preventing the receipt and mitigating unlawful robocalls. Next slide, please. The working group's next recommendation for service providers is to prioritize hospital entities. Recognizing that other entities, public safety agencies, for example, as well as the severity of a campaign's consumer impact, may also require prioritization. All voice service providers providing hospitals with voice services should, one, prioritize hospitals in their response and remediation efforts relating to unlawful robocalls, and two, utilize methods to alleviate burdens, including but not limited to administrative and operational burdens in response and remediation efforts for hospitals to the extent possible. And although there is no formal program or specification set forward on how to implement this, we believe that service providers have many internal processes that can be employed to achieve this prioritization. Next slide, please. The next two recommendations are somewhat related. They both allow hospitals to notify their voice service providers in the case of a robocall-related event. The first recommendation is to enable immediate inbound issue notification. All voice service providers providing hospitals with voice services should establish a method to ensure hospitals can expeditiously notify the voice service provider about receipt of unlawful calls and other communications that interfere with the delivery of patient care and or other hospital operations. If hospital operations are impacted by robocalling, they can make the service provider aware so that the service provider can take action. And the next related recommendation really addresses the false positive case on outbound calls so that hospitals can enable immediate outbound issue notification. Voice service providers providing hospitals with voice services should establish a method to ensure that hospitals can expeditiously notify the VSP about outgoing phone calls that are being blocked, are unauthenticated, or misidentified. Next slide, please. The last recommendation for service providers is to support the initiation of tracebacks. All voice service providers providing hospitals with voice services should actively cooperate with US Telecom's ITG or successor Traceback Consortium as mandated by the FCC and initiate traceback requests on behalf of hospital entities as appropriate. US Telecom leads the industry traceback group, which is really a collaborative effort across wireline, wireless, VoIP, and cable industries. They coordinate with federal and state law enforcement agencies to identify non-cooperative providers so they can take enforcement action as appropriate. Tracebacks are not something that should be needed frequently, particularly if the other recommendations of this report are followed, but hospitals should have access to the process if necessary, and service providers can support them in that. And that concludes the set of recommendations by Working Group 1.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and thank you, Working Group 1. Next, we will hear from John Hrpg, Chair of Working Group 2. He will talk about the second type of recommendations, how hospitals can better protect themselves from unlawful robocalls.
Thank you, everybody. Donna, if we could have the first slide. Good morning. And again, thanks, everybody. Certainly appreciate all the comments this morning on how disruptive to patient care operations robocalls can be, especially during the pandemic, potentially leading to a risk to patient safety. This morning, I'll provide details on the recommendations on how hospitals can better protect themselves from unlawful robocalls. Then we'll continue the discussion in a three-phased approach, starting with phase 1, prevention. First recommendation is for hospitals to increase education and awareness of the robocall problem. Hospital staff are usually the first to become aware of fraudulent, disruptive, or nuisance robocall activity within the hospital and health system. Training staff to identify and respond to robocall activity will reduce the impact to patients and personnel. One of the things we recommend is gather data on the suspected robocall, including the date and time of the calls, number being dialed, types of call, recordings, type of call, whether it's recording or live, and the volume of calls. Important to remind staff of their obligation to protect personally identifiable information, protected health information, and payment information of patients and staff. These are generally the types of data that robocalls are after, as it enables them to commit other crimes such as healthcare fraud and identity theft. Next slide, please. Continuing with prevention, it's recommended that hospitals be prepared to coordinate with voice service providers and law enforcement. Establishing a plan and governance process to coordinate with the VSPs and law enforcement is very important. We would recommend hospitals identify key points of contact prior to an event and resolve any legal and compliance issues internally, and again, work with the internal and external resources to integrate them into a robocall prevention and incident response plans. Some of the discussions might include voice service providers as well as facility equipment vendors. Determine the willingness of the hospital to report and work with and assist federal and state law enforcement agencies in the investigation of prosecution of robocall crimes. Work with the internal security team, cybersecurity, and telecom staff to establish procedures on the identification and gathering of technical and non-technical information related to the robocalls. This information may be used as evidence in a subsequent criminal or civil investigation and enforcement actions. Identify and establish relationships with designated points of contact with appropriate representatives of federal and state law enforcement regulatory agencies. We also recommend that hospitals have information available for patients and staff should they become a victim of a robocall scheme resulting in fraud or identity theft. One of the recommendations we make is the hospital should consider joining threat intelligence and information sharing organizations which offer contacts, resources, and information sharing between private industry and the government. Such groups are the FBI-sponsored InfraGard program, the Health Information and Sharing Analysis Center, known as the HISAC, and the American Hospital Association. Next slide, please. So let's move on to phase 2, response and mitigation, discussing some of the basic strategies and recommendations for responding to fraudulent or disruptive calls within the hospital network. First, we recommend that designated staff evaluate the event. Determine the event is a robocall event and what type. If unclear, reporting the incident to law enforcement for determination can be very helpful. Determine if the identified event is an isolated event or part of a larger campaign of robocalls. We also recommend they capture, again, the basic information, most recent date and time of calls, caller ID number displayed, caller name displayed, and the frequency of the calls. Second, we recommend implementation of internal controls. Contacting the hospital's internal telecom technicians to implement configuration changes and safeguards within the premise-based equipment to block spoof numbers where applicable, route to a single line extension to avoid disruption, or limit the number of calls into a line extension to isolate critical phone lines. Separate the affected phone numbers from other critical trunks. This might require coordination with the PBX provider and maintainer. Third, coordinate with federal and staff agencies and state agencies as appropriate. Hospitals should be familiar with the different types of unlawful robocalls they may receive and which types should be shared with government agencies. Federal and state law enforcement agencies may be able to assist hospitals, again, if the robocalls the hospitals are receiving constitute a violation of federal or state law. Calls designed to elicit sensitive, non-public or protected information, such as personally identifiable information or protected health information, may constitute multiple violations of federal and state civil or criminal laws. Likewise, social engineering calls can be designed to deceive the recipient into providing sensitive information to be used in the commission of another crime, such as healthcare fraud, various telemarketing frauds, and potentially identity theft. Reporting these calls also assists law enforcement, correlate a pattern from other victims, and assist them in the investigation, arrest, and prosecution of the perpetrators. Next slide, please. Continuing with the response and mitigation and further providing some further guidance and recommendations, we advise hospitals and staff to really limit engagement with the caller. Staff members should be instructed to never engage with the caller. Instruct the staff member to disconnect the call once it's detected to be a robocall, scam, or disruption event. Contact the voice service provider. Designated staff, such as security, should provide concise information to the voice service provider regarding the event to determine next steps in collaboration with the voice service provider. Traceback. The service provider may perform a network traceback to identify the carriers, routing of the calls into the hospital, and request that the upstream carriers cease and desist the continued delivery of such traffic. File a complaint with law enforcement or applicable regulatory or government agency, which we detail in the recommendations. For instance, we have details on how to contact the FTC at ftc.gov. Complaints can also be made to the FCC visiting their website, consumercomplaints.fcc.gov. Identity theft or cyber, regarding calls that involve identity theft or cyber attacks, we recommend that the victim, hospital, and the organization file a complaint with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, www.ic3.gov. Individual victims, patients, or staff members should report any financial loss to their financial institutions immediately. If the financial loss resulted through a bank wire transfer of funds, financial institutions may be able to recover the funds if the incident is reported within 72 hours. Report calls to your state attorney general's office, particularly those that appear to be connected, those calls that be connected to fraudulent schemes targeting hospital employees, which may resulting in a hospital becoming a victim or, again, financial loss to a patient. You can find state attorney generals by accessing the National Association of Attorney General website, which we do provide the details in the recommendations. Next slide, please. So we would also advise that recommend hospitals explore available robocall blocking capabilities. The hospital and voice server provider can review these potential solutions within the hospital or provider's network to stop inbound calling from specific numbers. This may include requesting a temporary block on a number used in a telephone denial of service attack. We also recommend that hospitals identify fraudulent, disruptive, or nuisance calls, again, with the voice service provider and the current services which may be available for call labeling and blocking. Identify appropriate contact information within your provider and how to respond to an event. Review also third-party offerings that may be available or installed in the hospital environment to assist in detecting and stopping unlawful robocall events. We also recommend telephony management. Not only do hospitals need to be aware of fraudulent, disruptive, and nuisance calls, attacks against their network, the identity of the hospital itself can be compromised and spoofed. Spoofing of a hospital numbers. In regard to this issue, until STIR Shaken is fully deployed and adopted, a hospital's number can be unlawfully spoofed. Through staff training, unlawfully spoofing can be identified through random complaints reported from individuals receiving the calls, not originated by the hospital. Segregation of numbers. Review and identify configuration of critical and non-critical lines. Discuss with your telephone system engineer or technician possible configuration changes to isolate critical phone lines from administrative and other lines. Again, we recommend taking into consideration hunt groups, busy or no answer rollovers to other lines. Again, hopefully in an effort to prevent an overload of non-critical lines. Next slide, please. Third phase is basically what we call the post-robocall phase. Again, assuming that law enforcement agencies have been contacting to determine if the law enforcement agency will investigate, determine if the local federal U.S. attorney or state attorney general's office will seek prosecution. Continue to provide assistance and information requested by law enforcement agencies is very important to establish and maintain contact with your law enforcement agency for case updates. This is very significant. To conduct an internal review or after action report after a robocall incident with all the entities involved and identify best practices and challenges. This is very important to document the lessons learned, and this will help continuously refine preparedness, countermeasures, and incident response. As a robocall perpetrators, they to have constantly evolved their tactics to penetrate hospital networks. You'll be certainly much better prepared to have that formal documented after action report and then take corrective actions as necessary. So again, thank you. It's been my privilege to have the opportunity to contribute to this very important body of work and help hospitals defend against illegal and disruptive robocalls. Back to you, Donna.
All righty. Thank you so much, John, and thank you to Working Group 2. And now, Creasy Johnson, Chair of Working Group 3, and Christy Thompson, member of Working Group 3, will now talk about the third type of recommendations, how the federal and state governments can help combat unlawful robocalls.
Thank you, Donna. Before I get into the actual recommendations, I thought I'd first give a brief overview of some of the state and federal agencies that are involved in combating robocalls. So the agencies that are listed here have authority to investigate and or bring enforcement actions against illegal robocallers. So there are other agencies that have authority as well. So some of the biggest robocalling scams have been the scam IRS calls and Social Security Administration calls. And both of those agencies are very active in this area, and they pursue those particular scams. The agencies listed here are the agencies that a hospital would be most likely to contact if it is experiencing a robocall event. Some of these agencies have criminal authority, obviously US DOJ and the FBI, and some state AGs have criminal authority as well. And criminal cases have an incredible deterrent effect. So those of us like me who only have civil authority are always very pleased when the criminal folks get involved. Most of our cases are civil. Traditionally, we have pursued cases against robocallers themselves, and we certainly still do that. An example is the last bullet point that's referencing a case brought by 8 attorney general's offices, including the 3 offices that are represented here on this committee, Michigan, Arkansas, and North Carolina. And the FCC brought a parallel proceeding against these same defendants. And more recently, really in the last year or two, law enforcement has begun to also take a closer look at the role of a handful of voice service providers out there that assist and facilitate these robocallers. So the first of those cases was a joint effort between the FTC and the Ohio Attorney General's office against Globex Telecom, which settled this summer. And the FTC settled a second case just 2 weeks ago against another VoIP provider, Alcazar. And Alcazar, despite being notified that its customers were sending illegal calls over its network, continued to allow them to convey millions of illegal calls. Similarly, US DOJ brought 2 actions this year against VoIP providers who were allowing millions of fraudulent calls to pass through their networks onto victims in the US. And many of these calls originated overseas. And again, despite being repeatedly notified that fraudulent calls were being transmitted over their networks, the court found that these VoIP providers had taken no action, and it entered an injunction prohibiting them from conveying any phone calls onto the US telephone system. So while law enforcement actions are obviously remedial in nature, they are brought after violations have occurred. We hope that they also serve to stem the tide of these calls and to prevent and to minimize future harm, which leads me into our recommendations in the prevention category. And I'm going to turn it back over to Christy Thompson from the FCC to present those recommendations.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. Yeah, so we as a group came up with a number of different ideas that we formulated and into our final recommendations for this group, and I'm very happy to be a part of that. So I'll just jump right in. The first one is to implement on the FCC side, to implement our own policies that will help the industry prevent unlawful robocalls from reaching hospitals in the first place. Sort of like the old saying that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that is very true when it comes to robocalls. And ultimately, my goal, and it sounds a little strange to say, but my goal is to someday be out of a job and to have to completely redo my career into something else because robocalls are no longer a problem. So towards that, we're recommending a number of different things, including first, call blocking and labeling tools for hospitals. And specifically, we recommend encouraging the continued development of those very important blocking and labeling tools and expanding their use throughout hospital networks. One of the most rewarding things to have watched over the 8 years that I have been really involved in tackling the robocalling problem has been to see the number of different apps and different creative solutions that have come up to help solve the problem of illegal robocalls. I think my favorite example is Aaron Foss's Nomo Robo, which has been adopted by so many people and who absolutely love that app, and it helps them sift out the bad traffic. So those kind of call blocking tools really help put the power back into the hands of the consumer, or in this case, in the hands of hospital networks, to sort of help themselves filter out unwanted calls, especially those pernicious illegal robocalls. We also recommend establishing and enhancing, as appropriate, safe harbors that will help incentivize increased call blocking. One of the challenges that we have been working on with industry and here in the government is finding a way to encourage blocking the bad traffic without accidentally encouraging blocking good traffic. It is sort of the opposite of a common carrier model to say, don't accept traffic. That the whole point of a common carrier is to accept traffic from everything and then from any source and then pass it along. But we need to incentivize providers and let them know that they can, in fact, and should block illegal robocalls that are just burdening the network and burdening end users with garbage spam calls. So that is why on the legislative and on the rulemaking front, we have worked so hard to establish guidelines for providers to use that give them safe harbors for when they can appropriately block those calls based on reasonable analytics. Then we also, third here is establishing and enforcing the industry's call authentication requirements that combat illegal spoofing. Call authentication is something a little bit more like call fingerprinting or the authentication that your email system uses. We want to make sure that if you receive a telephone call with a caller ID information, that you can trust that caller ID. Spoofing has been such, fake caller ID spoofing has been such a problem and such an enabler of illegal robocalls that it is one of the major attack points that we have been encouraging over the last few years to help solve that problem, which will in turn cut down on the number of illegal robocalls, make it easier for consumers to decide which calls they want to take and which ones they don't. That will include implementing stir shaken, I can't talk this morning, for the IP portions of voice provider networks, and also encouraging effective robocall mitigation programs. Part of that is the next bullet here, encouraging voice service providers to cooperate with traceback requests. Traceback is the heart and soul of robocall enforcement. It's how we find out where the illegal robocalls are coming from. And if voice service providers do not cooperate with those traceback requests, it really stymies our ability to identify the culprits behind these pernicious attacks and to hold them accountable and to stop the traffic before it reaches the end user. So having voice service providers cooperate with those traceback requests is absolutely critical. And then also identifying in cooperation with the voice service providers and in the industry, finding a way for hospitals to register their own numbers in order to minimize the inadvertent blocking of outbound calls from hospitals. One thing that we absolutely do not want to see is hospitals having their numbers inadvertently blocked from being able to make outbound calls because they are, if they're misidentified. We all know that the bad guys like to use other people's telephone numbers to make their illegal robocalls, and we don't want a good telephone number, especially a hospital's telephone number, being swept up in that net. Next slide, please. In addition, one of the things that we recommend the government do as well, something that government agencies really excel at, is to develop and distribute as widely as possible education materials specifically for hospitals to use. This is no one should have to become an expert at the telecommunications industry in order to protect themselves from robocalls. And the government can certainly help by demystifying a lot of the complex issues that go into running a telephone network and how robocalls happen and what is spoofing. There are as previous speakers have talked about, there are different types of robocall attacks that can happen. One, informed, to be informed is to be better prepared to deal with all of those. So the first major thing that government can help educate the hospital industry on is what are the different types of robocall events. Some of them are very hospital specific. Some of them are not hospital specific at all. They are the same kind of illegal robocalls that flood our personal cell phones, that flood any large enterprise. that has a lot of telephone lines. And so it's not a specific attack or a targeted attack on hospitals, but it is a disruptive event. So understanding the difference between those things is very important so that you know what the correct response to that is. Then identifying for hospitals things that they can, information that they can collect if they are, the unfortunate recipient of a flood of robocalls or one of those robocall events. There are specific kinds of data that hospitals should collect at the time that is happening that are absolutely crucial for government agencies to have if we're going to find out where those robocalls came from and to stop them from happening, either stopping them in real time, which we are better able to do every day, or afterwards finding out who the culprit was and holding them accountable. That kind of information includes the date and exact time of the call, or as close as possible as we can get, the number that received the telephone call, so the receiving phone numbers, who did it hit, how many of the phone lines were hit, etc. The number that it was displayed on caller ID. Sadly, we all know that we can't trust that number that's on caller ID, and that it is no doubt spoofed, as it is in many cases. But that information is critical for finding the record of that telephone call among billions of other calls that are made that day. Understanding and marking down whether the caller was a live person or whether it was a pre-recorded message. That is a critical information because it tells us, is there an actual scammer on the line here, for example, who's trying to use social engineering to elicit some information that they shouldn't have access to? Or was this just a pre-recorded message, press 1 because this is the IRS calling, or press 1 to hear about some amazing vacation deals. And then, the content of the message. What was it about? Was it in fact were they fishing for information specifically from the hospital, from the recipients? Was it a government imposter scam? They're pretending to be a law enforcement agency, or Social Security is the most popular one now. Was it just a straight up telemarketing, buy some scammy timeshares or health insurance products or what have you? That kind of information is critical for us too, because it helps us group together. If it helps us group together robocalling events so that we know what the bad guys are doing and how far they're taking their activities. Sadly, I've never seen a robocall violator who did a one and done campaign. It's always seems to be multiple targets over multiple areas, and gathering that information is critical to understand and identify who's the culprit. Next, on the next point here, which law enforcement agencies to contact? Something that I mentioned earlier in the first part of the presentation is that the government is taking a very much a collaborative, team-based approach to this. We are sharing information with each other and resources with each other, and trying to maximize the number of illegal robocallers that we are tackling by maximizing each agency's enforcement efforts against them and collaborating in that way. So fortunately, we're in a target-rich, unfortunately, we're in a target-rich environment. But what that means is that different law enforcement entities have different powers that they may use, as Creasy highlighted just previously. Like her, I am only a civil authority, and I have some jealousy for my badge wielding friends who have criminal authority, as I would like nothing more than to see the robocallers spend some time behind bars. But it is important when different kinds of robocall attacks require or really deserve different types of enforcement actions. So a telemarketer that's selling, scammy travel deals, obnoxious. A one who's actually trying to harm other people by stealing their identities or committing fraud against them, that's criminal. So something the first step that the hospitals can really, help themselves and help us on is understanding the different law enforcement avenues that are out there and who is really the best person to call. When to call the FBI, when to call the FCC or the FTC, when to call your state attorneys general or multiple agencies as may be involved. That is really critical to helping, for a hospital to help itself. And sometimes just knowing who to call is, 90% of the problem solved. Descriptions of, these educational materials should also include descriptions of the available call blocking and labeling tools. In our discussions, one of the things that we really talked about was making it more widely known, what is out there for hospitals to use and consider implementing in their networks to help cut down on the number of illegal robocalls. And that may also include, doing that ahead of time if a hospital has not started receiving a tremendous number of illegal robocalls. It's never too early to implement those kind of tools in advance to stop that from happening in the first place. Then also including where and how hospitals can register their own numbers to limit the possibility that those numbers are inadvertently blocked or mislabeled. That's something else that's very important. We don't want hospitals to find themselves the victims of inadvertent blocking just because someone out there spoofed their telephone number and they were accidentally put on a list. So having hospitals working with the industry to register those numbers is another recommendation. And then finally, where and how hospitals can get redress from incidents where their outbound calls were inadvertently blocked or mislabeled. So in the event that that does happen, those educational materials should also provide a clear guidelines for here's who you call if you're experiencing problems because of inadvertent blocking and how to get that fixed. So next slide, please. And then my favorite slide, of course, the one that's all about enforcement. Our recommendation here is to enforce the existing laws, rules, and policies against any voice service providers that are allowing unlawful traffic to originate on their network or calling platform. And that also includes enforcing the laws and rules as appropriate against non-originating voice service providers that have not taken sufficient steps to mitigate the transmission of illegal robocalls. Historically, we have focused our enforcement efforts, of course, on the robocallers themselves and not necessarily on the voice service providers that have been facilitating those calls. But as we continue to combat illegal robocalls and take enforcement actions against them, holding voice service providers accountable, the ones that are enabling unlawful robocallers to really thrive in this ecosystem, is proving to become a very successful part of the overall strategy to reduce the number of illegal robocalls that are traversing the network. We're really wanting to and starting to hold those voice service providers accountable for the traffic that they carry and they deliver to end users. These efforts are very much both prevention and remediation, but overall, our goal here is to help the industry self-police, and that the result of it, so that the result is that there are just simply fewer robocalls that reach hospital telephone lines at the end. So increased vigilance on the part of voice service providers about what kind of traffic they're carrying and being responsive to notifications from the industry Traceback group that they need to stop carrying certain traffic because it's unlawful are critical points here. And with that, I will turn it back over to Chrissy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christy. All right, thanks so much. We can go to the next slide. Great. Okay, so as for our response and mitigation recommendations, I think the key to our recommendations here is really communication and, as Christy pointed out, collaboration. So First, we want to be sure that hospitals know where to call when they need help with a robocall event. They will likely want to contact their provider immediately, but we also want to be sure that law enforcement agencies are notified so that we can keep apprised of what's happening and decide if there's a need for us to step in and issue investigative subpoenas or seek court orders. We want to continue our existing collaboration with industry, and in particular the ITG, so that if law enforcement finds out about a robocall event affecting a hospital, we can make a referral to the ITG for traceback and investigation, and vice versa. If the ITG is aware of a problem, it can share information with the relevant law enforcement agencies. So we recommend continuing to collaborate and coordinate amongst ourselves. We can bring additional resources to cases and investigations when we work together as law enforcement agencies. Sometimes we coordinate on the investigative side, sharing documents, information, and then we bring separate proceedings. And then sometimes we bring enforcement actions jointly. So particularly for the states where we have the jurisdictional limits of our individual states, it's helpful for us to work together, and we can have a greater impact when we do. Next slide. Thank you. So we recommend seeking additional ways to communicate and coordinate with foreign governments. A huge percentage of the illegal robocalls that are infiltrating the US phone system are coming from overseas. I know that US DOJ and the FTC have had some success against Indian call centers. And so where possible, we would like to create and continue collaborative efforts with other governments. And finally, our working group realized in the course of our conversations that there's not a lot of data out there on hospital robocall events. So we've heard individual stories from around the country, but we thought it would be worthwhile to collect more comprehensive data on what is happening and then evaluate the response to these events so that we can figure out what works and hopefully improve on the response in the future. And that concludes the recommendations of Working Group 3. And I will now pass it back to Donna. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Creasy and Christy. Thank you, Working Group 3. And now I would like to turn the meeting over to Hrpg Chair Dave Summit.
Hi, thank you, Donna. So thank you for the presentations. We appreciate it. We're now opening the floor for final discussion. Okay, hearing of no request for discussion, is there a motion to adopt the report and its recommendations and approve their submission to the commission for further action under the Trace Act?
I so move.
Creasy Johnson makes the motion. Is there a second?
I second the motion.
Joseph Delato has made the second motion to adopt the report and its recommendations and approve their submission to the commission. It has been properly moved and seconded. I will now do a roll call of all Hrpg members. If you're in favor of the report's adoption and submission, say aye. If you are opposed, say nay. Dave Summit, aye. Patrick Howley,
Aye.
John Cunningham,
Aye.
Joseph Delato,
Aye.
Linda Vanderloop, come back to her, absent for the moment. Mark Collier.
This is Linda. Aye. I was double muted. Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you. Mark Collier. Move on. Aaron Foss.
Aye.
John Brayolt.
Aye.
DeWitt Kasai.
Aye.
Irene Leach.
Aye.
Gunnar Halley.
Aye.
Rebecca Johnson. Move on. Chris Shipley.
Aye.
Richard Lovich.
Aye.
John Hrpg.
Aye.
Creasy Johnson,
Aye.
David McCoy,
Aye.
Weissam Nowem,
Aye.
Commissioner Brendan Carr.
Hi, if his car is
sorry,
off, this isn't.
Yep,
Oh, I'm sorry. There you
yeah,
are.
still here. Thank you,
Good,
Greg.
okay.
I'm here, I'm present. I'm not going to cast an official vote in case some of the recommendations come up before the full FCC. There's some APA and issues with that. So I'm here. I'm going to vote to, I'm going to abstain from voting, but obviously express my appreciation to the group. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you. Commissioner Noah Phillips.
Echoing Commissioner Carr, and for the same reasons, a supportive abstain on this vote.
Very good. Thank you very much. The motion, we have no nays. The motion to adopt the report and its recommendations and approve their submission to the commission has been properly moved and seconded. Really appreciate it. And hearing this vote and no opposing votes, the motion passes. And the Hospital Robocall Protection Group adopts its reports on best practices to help protect hospitals from unlawful robocalls. Thank you all for your hard work.
Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you, everyone. Greg, I'm going to turn this over to you to read any questions or comments from the public.
Thanks, Donna, and thanks to everybody for such a great work, great report, great meeting. It's just been a privilege to be part of this. I'm keeping my eyes open. I am supposed to be getting any emails from the outside that are coming into FCC gov.live, and I don't have any yet. So but we are running a little tiny bit ahead of time. If we want to give it a minute or two, but actually, let me just double check. I don't think we've gotten any. You know, for anybody who's watching the YouTube out in the public, if your emails haven't gotten through to us, we'll know where you are, and we can certainly get an answer to you if we're not able to do so today. So let me just do one last check to make sure. But so far, no questions.
Okay. All right. So then this concludes the final meeting of the Hospital Robocall Protection Group. Thank you all for your participation. It has been wonderful working with each and every one of you. Thank you. And this meeting is adjourned.